Hey, my name is Kelvin B. Fisher, and I'm a sci-fi writer and fan. The Division 2 is one of my forever games. I never uninstall it. The game sits on my hard drive because I know that I'll be back to play it again. I'd say about once a year or so, I get an itch to jump in. So I come back and find out what's new. The Division 2 appeals to me for a couple main reasons. First off, I thoroughly enjoy the gameplay loop. It's probably my favorite third-person shooter gameplay-wise. Darting between cover, having to reposition from pretty intelligent and varied enemies, while picking up new gear and building out a character just hits a spot that other games don't quite scratch. The other main appeal is the world, setting, and aesthetic. The Division series takes place in a post-apocalyptic America, taking place very soon after the country has fallen from a cataclysmic virus. You play as an agent of the Strategic Homeland Division of the US government. Division agents act fully autonomously, and their chief mission is to restore order to the country. The aesthetic hits this perfect balance of ragged survivors plus tactical military gear. The world is meticulously designed, and you get lost in its detail and immersion. Even though the subject of the world is a post-apocalypse, which is normally a very dreary subject, the New York City created in the first game and the Washington, D.C. in the second are just sights to behold. I enjoy stepping into the shoes of my Division agent and facing down whatever challenges the apocalypse decides to throw at me. The Division 2 is a live service game, which means that it's supported long-term by its developers with content updates. Recently, the first Year 5 update was released, which includes an all-new mode called The Descent. The Descent takes the core shooting gameplay of the Division, but turns the surrounding mechanics on their head. What I mean is this: the Division is all about developing your Division agent and improving their skills, traits, and abilities. This means that your agent is a long-term commitment of sorts. I've had my agent for the past 5 years, for instance, and I've built him out to be good at certain things but not other things. He deals high damage, but he does not take damage very well. The Descent is an entirely separate mode from the main game. None of your character's stats carry over. Each time you play the mode, you start at square one. You're able to select between a random set of guns, and you have to fight through a random arrangement of rooms with random enemy encounters. When you complete a room, you get to choose a randomized perk to upgrade your character. So, randomness is the name of the game. The selling point of this new mode is that each run will provide a brand new experience. And so far, out of the couple hours that I've played this mode, I've had a lot of fun. Being separated from your main character's gear and stats means you get a lot more room to experiment with different weapon types, skills, and perks. As a result, I've tried out a whole bunch of skills, guns, and perks that I haven't really touched. And in that sense, it's been a refreshing experience. Yet, at the same time, even as I enjoyed the gameplay variety, I felt like something big was missing. The mode is a training simulation for your agent, lore-wise. You can see this when you play The Descent. There are green grids that pop out from the environment, reminding the player that they're in this computerized simulation. As I continue to play, I found myself longing to go back and play some of the Division's main story missions instead, even though I had played them many times before. Even though the gameplay wasn't as stimulating as this new mode with its randomized parameters and increased variety. And that, to me, is interesting. And it got me thinking, why did I want to go back and play old story missions? To be honest, I didn't pay that much attention to the story, so it wasn't nostalgia for that. And it wasn't just visual variety either. The Descent does have some visual variety of its own. No, it was more than that, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. So I went back and replayed some story missions, and I think I can finally put words to the appeal. It's the world, and how the world gives context to your actions, even subliminally. It's something you don't notice, really, until it's gone. So that's what this video is going to be about. We're going to take a deep dive into 2 levels, the Air and Space Museum and the DCD headquarters. We'll see how these levels instill this feeling of purpose, even without the context of a direct narrative. Then we'll contrast these against the new Descent mode. The Air and Space Museum level starts with our Division agent entering the grounds of the museum. Immediately we're struck by overgrowth. Weeds sprawl out everywhere, seeming to gobble up every inch of concrete available. This puts us into the apocalyptic setting. A museum like this, in a functioning society, would have an immaculately cared for lawn. Especially one as prestigious as the Air and Space Museum. Another thing that stands out right away is a crane, which is holding up part of an airplane. This small detail itself creates a micro-story. You can imagine the day that the virus really took a hold of the city, and that some guy was operating this crane, moving the plane parts around to be transported into an exhibit. You get a sense for how hard the apocalypse hit, and how quickly society fell. It's not something you consciously think about either, you just intuitively understand. A few small details sprinkled throughout this environment really are all that's needed to spell out the setting. There are makeshift tents set up, they look government issued. The grounds of the museum were used by the government as a means to handle the pandemic here. It looks like people were taken in at some point. There is no sign of that government here now though, except for your division agent. There are hostiles guarding the grounds. At some point, the government moved out and these bad guys moved in. Whether the government agents were forced out or whether the enemies have moved into the vacant space, it doesn't really matter. The vacancy of the government and the presence of these bad guys is a reminder that the world is no longer friendly, and it's getting less friendly by the day. This museum, which once may have symbolized a day of learning and relaxation, is now a dangerous place. After our division agent clears out the threat, he proceeds to enter the museum via the parking garage. We're met by a shattered window. It sets the expectation that the interior of the museum has been touched by the apocalypse as well. The parking garage is dark, dirty, and dingy. Enemies lurk about. Once they've been taken care of, we proceed. Next lay the restoration room. In museums, this is where works of art are taken to be restored for exhibition. This room strikes a mood almost immediately. Pale light casts down to the ground. From the haziness of the light beams, you can almost feel the dust particles floating in the air. Stacks and stacks of paper sit on the plain desks. This room does a great job of establishing a setting. A restoration room is something that you don't see in every building, obviously. This is only something that you'd find in a museum. The stacks of files and papers sends a similar message to the crane outside. One day people were working hard in this area, and then suddenly they weren't. The hallway is quiet. There aren't any enemies. The stillness is even more pronounced. This hallway hammers the two facts of the setting. One, that it takes place in a famed museum, and two, that it shortly follows the apocalypse. Next, the division agent enters one of the main floors of the museum. What strikes you first is the airplanes hanging from the ceilings. Likewise, there are cranes, pallets, and fencing. The planes hang in the air, and the planetarium is sitting off in the corner. This isn't just any place, it's the Air and Space Museum, and that fact really strikes you here. Maybe it's because I've been to the museum this is based off of in the real world, but the environment feels very authentic, and that gives this setting a very unique grounding in reality. It makes the differences from the current Air and Space Museum stand out all the more. The fencing in the museum is barbed, and it has a big checkpoint sign. It's evident that this aberration was set up during the apocalypse to manage the flow of refugees or people otherwise displaced by society's fall. Again, the government is nowhere to be found. In their place are enemies, with no regard for rebuilding the world, instead only after their own interests. That's what the division is here for, to retake the city from anarchists and petty tyrants, one street corner at a time. So, the environmental detail is telling a story, and it's a simple story that we can understand, beyond the particulars of this campaign mission. I'll come back to this point later. With the lobby area cleared, the division agent proceeds into the aforementioned planetarium. The planetarium is visually breathtaking to say the least. After the Grinch, muck, and mire of the apocalypse, a grand otherworldly sight like this is refreshing and memorable. Past the dazzling visuals, this room gives you a keen sense of place. You're not going to see a room like this anywhere but an aerospace museum, but it goes further than that. As you fight through enemies in the planetarium, the automated presentation plays, and a formal, pleasant-sounding woman walks through facts about the universe.
Humanity has been observing the planets for millennia, but we are only now beginning to uncover some of their secrets. Earth, the third rock from the sun, our home may not be the center of our universe, but so far it is the only planet that can support life as we know it.
The contrast between the two is evident. The presentation evokes memories of the past. Many people have heard information presentation like this when they visited museums or while in school. It's a reminder of the old days, of the days before the apocalypse. This reminder is contrasted against the battle the division agent is currently embroiled in. This reminder brings the division's purpose into view, the vision of bringing the world back from pure survival to restored functioning society. With the planetarium cleared out, the agent ascends to the second level. There's a nice sense of progression as you overlook the first floor that you cleared out. The second floor is adorned with airplanes and images of airmen hanging on the walls. The museum setting reigns. However, there's a crash plane to your left. The stains and stars of the apocalypse can never be escaped. What follows is my favorite room in the game. It's another presentation room, much like the planetarium, but this time the theme is rovers on Mars. We hear the nice presenter once again provide facts about the Mars missions as the Division agent fights through enemies with the beautiful skyline of Mars in the background. The view is my favorite in the game, and the unique setting is once again reinforced. The presentation echoes the world that was lost, and in this case, the lost opportunities on other planets due to the apocalypse. Once the exhibit is cleared out, the Division agent continues making his way through the museum, descending back to the first floor. This culminates in a final battle against the boss enemy, with more space exploration props littering the background. After the boss is defeated, you're rewarded with a mission completed screen. The Division agent has taken back the museum from the city's rogue elements. The step towards order and stability may be small, but the progress is still there. And that is the Air and Space Museum. You'll notice that I've been pretty vague about the story of this level, particularly the enemies you face, as I've only really referred to them as hostiles. That was very much intentional. The Division 2 is a role-playing game focused on repeating missions and other activities for new gear, so it's intended for you to replay missions. In fact, the Division 2 cycles out which enemies you fight in this very same mission. There are times when an enemy faction called the Blast Tusk overtakes areas of Washington, D.C. To liberate these areas, you have to replay missions like the Air and Space Museum, albeit with the Black Tusk as a foe instead of the original faction. Given this format, the context provided by a specific story changes. The enemies you face change. However, the level largely remains the same. And if you're grinding out the same level over and over for gear, whatever the specific story is will fade out into the background anyway. However, there is still a story here that the environment tells. Meta story is maybe the right term, although that sounds pedantic. Each time you play, the environment gives you these details that spell out a basic narrative. It's not a narrative that you absorb all that consciously. Instead, you soak up all the little details like a sponge, even if you're not explicitly paying attention to them. So in a sense, you feel the story rather than think about it mentally. That story is that you're a Division agent. The city has fallen, and the evidence is all around you. There are bad guys here who are preventing the world from getting better. You're here to take back the city and drive these foes out. So yeah, that story is pretty darn simple. But if you experience it, that's the important thing. It drives this sense of purpose when you're playing a level, because you can feel that meta story in the direction it provides. Because of that, when you beat a mission, you get this sense of satisfaction at accomplishing your in-game purpose that wouldn't otherwise be there. It gives you a basic story. It gives you this basic loop that sustains over multiple playthroughs when you're past contemplating the main story. It sustains even when the enemy faction switches. And because that story is really felt more than thought about, and because it's so basic, it holds up over subsequent playthroughs. Here's a pretty off-the-wall analogy, but I hope it illustrates my point. Think about Phineas and Ferb, the cartoon. It's a show with a pretty basic plot that pretty much every single episode follows. Phineas and Ferb come up with some sort of contraption and build it during the summer. Their sister Candace gets mad and tries to tattle on them. But right when their mom gets home, Phineas and Ferb's adventure has come to an end and all evidence is gone. The plot is simple, but that's one of its strengths. You can watch a handful of episodes in a row without getting bored because they provide that simple story loop. Now take a complex plot like seen in the movie Inception. If you try to watch that movie 5 or 6 times in a row, well, you're going to get pretty burned out. The way that the Division can create a narrative through its environment and create this simple loop is something I find pretty impressive. It underscores just how powerful environmental storytelling can be in instilling a sense of purpose. Let's use another one of my favorite levels as an example, the DCD headquarters. I'm not going to do a room-by-room analysis of this one, but I'll still illustrate the point. The level opens with the player approaching the DCD building. It's a very Washington, D.C.-esque building, with Roman architecture that includes big white pillars. Without any context, you can tell that this is a governmental building for disease control. There's yellow everywhere, the color for warning or danger. Combined are hazard logos plastered onto everything. Checkpoints have been set up, with decontamination chambers in the same bright yellow. Enemies prowl the grounds, ready to attack anybody who ventures near. So right away, the level's visual design establishes the same story that we saw with the Air and Space Museum. The world has crumbled with the onset of the virus. Hostile factions are filling the void. By the Division agent approaching the building, The agency's mission can be intuitive. We're taking the world back, and that includes this building. After taking out the enemies, the division agent enters the DCD building. From there is a sound sense of progression created by the level's layout and environmental design. The further the agent goes into this governmental facility, the more grotesque the level's sights become. The facility becomes more and more disordered. An increasing number of bodies, hastily thrown in body bags, litter the grounds. It gets dense enough to where you feel like you're wading through death itself. The most memorable part is when our agent calls an elevator up. The elevator lumbers up the shaft far too slowly. When it reaches the agent's level, we can see why the ascent was so slow. The elevator is piled to the ceiling with the deceased, far past the load capacity. The elevator trembles before plummeting into the abyss below. It creates dread immediately for whatever's down there. This is such an uneasy sight that the unease it gives you persists through multiple runs of the level. The agent heads down into the darkness and makes his way through the morgue. The story is apparent. There were attempts at containing the deceased in the morgue, but eventually there became too many bodies and they struggled with where to put them. It's a simple story, but again, it resonates because of its simplicity. The division agent finally retrieves his objective in the research library. The actual item hardly matters. This level, like the last, is cycled with different factions. The first time I played through, I faced the Outcast faction. Then I played through again and faced off against the Black Tusk. There are small differences in the objectives. For instance, the Black Tusk version ends with the agent having to take down a helicopter. The Outcast version ends with the player having to simply secure the area by taking down enemies. Despite these differences in context, the level design and layout remains largely the same. And furthermore, the player will probably replay this mission so many times anyway for new gear and stats that the specific context fades in relevancy. So overall, this level's design provides an undercurrent of a story. The world has been overtaken after the cataclysmic outbreak. The government tried to stop it, but they couldn't and society fell. Miscreants fill the power void. This place, the DCD building for disease research, is a special place of significance. And the player feels the importance. And they feel this story. The agent descends, seeing increasing horrors of the virus until their mission is achieved. Then they must fight their way back through the darkness and escape to the light. And that story's simplicity is again what sustains it over repeated playthroughs. It's not a story you cognizantly think about. It's a story that you feel through the level and environmental design. This results in a sense of purpose when playing a level, and an intrinsic sense of satisfaction after you complete it. Even when you play this level many times, in the main narrative, in context of why you're doing what you're doing fades away, and when the enemies and context is switched out for something new. So, we've covered two of the Division's main story levels. Let's contrast these with the new mode called the Descent. This environmental storytelling is like the bass player in a rock band. When the band's jamming out, the bass isn't something you'll likely focus a lot on. However, if you took that bass out of the composition, you'd notice its absence. That is pretty similar to how I felt when playing the Descent. To refresh you, in the Descent, you take on randomized enemies in randomized rooms, trying out new perks and weapons. And just to reiterate, the game mode is a lot of fun. I think the gameplay loop is refreshing and varied. However, the story is essentially that your Division agent is in a training simulation. It's a Simulation ranks as one of the most uncompelling setups out there, sitting right next to This Is All a Dream. The reason is that your actions don't matter within the context of the game world. You're not a Division agent that's taking back a legendary museum or trudging through a research facility to stop baddies from acquiring dangerous information. You're in a high-tech training room. There's no sense of stakes. There's no drama. But you may be thinking to yourself right now, hey, he's not being very fair. With the museum and DCD levels, he didn't talk about the main story or lore, but with the Descent he is. Well, the reason why is because the level layouts and designs of the Descent constantly remind you that you're in a simulation. By nature of the game mode, the levels are procedurally generated to be different every time. On top of that, the player gets to choose between multiple levels when advancing. It's essentially a randomly generated tree, where the player gets to pick which branches they traversed on. So it's randomness on top of randomness. The levels may share common props like being in research labs or bunkers. However, you don't get a sense of progression in the level layouts because they're randomized. With the DCD level, you could feel the progression through the increasing aura of death as you descend deeper by the ever-increasing stacks of bodies. Or, in the Air and Space Museum, where you're actively passing through memorable exhibits and get this tactile sense of actually going through a museum. The lack of progression caused by the randomness mean that the descent levels distinctly lack a sense of story. After all, a story without progression isn't really a story. It's a static image at best. This effect is worsened by one art design choice. In every level, green wireframes litter the map. They mimic assets that the simulation hasn't quite gotten around to loading in yet. It's a blatant intentional reminder that this is all a simulation. And it's a big sign that essentially screams, don't get immersed. These are little things, but when you combine them, it results in that aimless, purposeless sense I got when playing. I'm taking on baddies, sure, but it doesn't really feel like it means anything. Even when the gameplay is stellar, and even when the environments are varied. If there isn't a story to that environment, it just feels a bit hollow. Before I wrap up, I have to do a quick plug of my book. I'm a science fiction writer, and I have a post-apocalyptic series called the Northfield Saga. It takes place in a world scraping back from a decade-old apocalyptic event, one which left the world consumed in toxic gas. If you're a fan of The Division and its world, I really think you'll like my series. It's essentially in the same vein of fiction. The books are quick reads, but it has a lot of world building, character building, and action. So, please consider checking it out. I sincerely think you'd enjoy it. And now, to tie a bow on this whole video. Level layouts and designs play a big part in establishing a game world, but past that, they can provide the player a sense of purpose even without the context of a main story. I think the effects are subtle and not something you always consciously pick up on, as you often feel the purpose rather than contemplate it. However, you can really notice the effects when they're taken away. The Division 2 in its stellar world building and design make a great case study for this. I hope this video didn't come across as overly analytical or pedantic, but it's sometimes hard to articulate why something makes you feel a certain way, and I did my best to try and nail it down here. I hope that this video gives some food for thought, at least. If you enjoyed it, please consider dropping a like, subscribing, or checking out my Northfield series. This is Kelvin B. Fisher, and I'll see you next time.